Welcome to the Leadership Podcast, where our disagreements inform your decisions. I'm Dion Dixon, and I'm here today with my co-hosts Brett Miller, Thea Alley, and Will Atkins. Please, if you haven't already, like and subscribe and share us with your friends and family. Today, we're going to pick up where we left off last week. Last week, we were talking in general about rights and where you get them from. And today we're going to hone in on probably what is one of the most contentious rights that was enshrined in our Constitution, the right to keep and bear arms. So the way that I thought we would structure this today is we would talk about what is actually written in the Second Amendment and look at what scholars have said those words actually mean. There will be a little bit of debate there. And then what I think is probably more important to all of you listeners and viewers out there is, okay, whatever they said, 250 years ago, what does that mean for me today? And so my hope is that we can have a good spirited discussion and debate about what those words meant then when they put them to parchment and what they mean for us today. So does anybody have the words right in front of them that they want to read? If not, I've got them.
I do. So it's the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So it's pretty short and sweet, which I don't think a lot of people realize how short the Second Amendment really is. But yeah, so that's what it says.
Okay, so I think we should probably go through it and sort of define what all of that means, because I think a lot of people will put on their 21st century glasses when they read that, and they'll come away with a certain meaning that is not necessarily what our founding fathers meant. So let's start with the first two words, or first couple of words, a well-regulated militia. So what did our founding fathers mean by well-regulated? Thea?
I guess number one, I guess it's important for me to state that I'm not a fan when it comes to interpreting constitutional law, doing things specifically piecemeal, because I do think that the whole, how all of the words work together is how you gain the meaning. So I know con law, one of the big things is like, what does this one word mean? And so I don't necessarily think that it's always as simple as being able to say, okay, well, this is what this word means, and so this is what they meant, without taking it in the context of the full body of whatever the clause is, or in here, the amendment. So I do think, well, I guess what I've always taken it to mean is that there was some type of militia, right? So it's not just the idea of well-regulated. I always took it as that it was insinuating that there was some type of organized body, and that this right was tied to being part of an organized body, and that body was something that was, had some type of structure and regulation to it. I'm being pretty flexible here in not trying to say it absolutely needed to be regulated by a particular level of government, because I think this is where we will agree. I don't necessarily think the intent is to say the founders meant for everything to have to be regulated by the federal government or even the state, at the state level. But I do think they interpreted it's this right to be tied to some type of organized body. I think that's me rambling, but it's me trying to kind of keep the definition broad.
Yeah.
And so I do tend to agree with you on that it's, I take your point when we were talking before we started recording about any able-bodied male type thing. But surely there were people who were not going to fight, right? That although they were an able-bodied male between the age of whatever to whatever, they would not have considered themselves to be a part of the militia. So I do tend to agree that we're talking about an organized body, but it's not, to Thea's point about the individual words, it's not a sword I would be willing to fall on.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Well, so again, one of the things that I intended this part for was just to make sure that we don't only interpret the words by the way that they have come to mean today. So I think what a lot of people today in America hear when they read the words "a well-regulated militia," to them, well-regulated means more in terms of the way that we use like regulations and restrictions today by the government. And I don't think that, like, based on my research, that's not what well-regulated meant in 1789. Well-regulated meant more like how your heartbeat is regular, in that it is organized and disciplined. And so so I take your point, Thea and Will, about it, who is doing the disciplining and organizing. And I think the founding fathers agreed and intended that would be the state or the local government. I don't think that they, especially because they put that prefatory clause in there about excuse me, about the militia. I don't think that they intended that this to be like in a vacuum away from the militia. At the same time, Will, you brought up a discussion we were having before we turned on the camera about the militia being all able-bodied men aged 18 to 45. And, the thing that I was thinking of is, so one, and we could talk about this in a little bit. In my research, I saw several different drafts where some of the drafts actually included basically a conscientious objector part of the amendment that got dropped, but they were clearly thinking of that. So that would be an instance of somebody who would not be part of the militia. But I ask, do we really think that they would have then said to those people, well, you don't have the right to bear arms because you're not part of the militia? Or would they have been allowed to keep those arms because they were used for hunting and self-defense?
I think we jumped ahead of one thing that I think is important to discuss is what was the reasoning behind this amendment, right? So like, for example, the Third Amendment, it's one of those that today kind of sounds silly, like, oh, you're not going to allow people to quarter, soldiers to quarter in people's homes. But obviously we know during the Revolutionary War and, and during, the time in which these documents were being written, these were rights that had been infringed upon by, the government or, or I don't know if you want to call it the government, but the Brits or whatever, so there is a sensitivity as to, okay, we don't want these things to happen moving forward with this new government that we formed. So we're going to put these rights in place to try to set these limits. Right. And so I think, like the thing that with the Second Amendment, it's this idea that you want the people to have the ability to stand up against the government, right? And if they don't have the right to bear any type of arms, then what chance do they have if they need to rebel again, right? What chance do the people have? And so I do think that's part of the discussion. I know that was part of your research, but I just wanted to lay that foundation before we jump into, well, what's a militia and is kind of keeping in the back of our minds that this was a right that was not necessarily just set up for individual, my individual rights. It was looked at as collectively giving people, just like we have the right to assemble and free speech, it's for the purpose or not. One main purpose behind it was to give the people the ability to rebel and have a real chance of doing so if needed. So from that perspective, I think then we can continue with the conversation.
Yeah. So no, I appreciate that, Thea, and I think you make a very good point. So I'm going to jump down in my notes to an amendment that was proposed during the Constitutional Convention, because I think it kind of encapsulates exactly what you were talking about and what their overarching thought process was. And this was a motion by Burke in the House, August 17th, 1789. And he said, "A standing army of regular troops in time of peace is dangerous to public liberty, and such shall not be raised or kept up in time of peace, but from necessity and for the security of the people, nor then without the consent of 2/3 of the members present of both houses, and in all cases the military shall be subordinate to the civil authority. So I think that right there kind of points to their largest fear was the federal government, the big nation being able to tyrannize its people. Do we have any disagreements on that? No, I don't think so.
No.
Okay.
So that was one of the big things, is differentiating between the militia and the standing army.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think maybe an important point to talk about, and one of the reasons why I kind of wanted to launch into some of these definitions is because, like, I remember I was taught in high school, militia in the Second Amendment means the National Guard. And that's not quite a direct equivalent. The founding fathers never could have envisioned the National Guard that we have today. And even though the National Guard is normally Title 32 under each governor, so they each own their own little portion, the total force structure that we have is much less like a state militia and much more like just other arms of a national standing army. And I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with I think it's Free Our National Guard efforts.
So no, but Florida stood up its own state guard, separate from the National Guard, for some of those exact reasons.
Yeah, so there's an effort around the nation where some of the states are saying, wait a second, the National Guard is supposed to be the militia, the guard is supposed to be for the state, except in these very specific cases. But you keep deploying all of our troops all over the world for these various deployments and exercises that have nothing to do with these three very specific reasons. So anyways,
I think that's a big difference when we kind of throw out calling it the National Guard, right? It's a state-run thing, but it's the National Guard. So people assume like, oh, you're there for the nation. And no, that's not the case. It's one of those, like, the militia in a sense was supposed to be a decentralized force, completely distinct from professional military. And that was even drawn back. You go to 1903, the Militia Act of 1903, which is also referred to as the Dick Act. It separated the organized militia and the unorganized militia. And that's where we get the language repeating itself again, where the organized militia is the National Guard, and then you have the unorganized militia, which is the able-bodied citizens between 17 and 45, which are not active duty citizens, right? That they're supposed to be part of the civilian force in that regards. And so that's keeping that separation there.
Yeah. And then, so going back to the able-bodied men, which this is another distinction between 1789 and 2025. As we all know, in 2025, there are Blacks, there are women, there are other people of color, there are transgender, there are whatever, all serving in our armed forces and doing a fantastic job. Of course, in 1789, when they referred to the militia, they meant essentially white men, white free men, because there were actually white indentured servants and slaves too. So, but going back to that, and going back to the idea of the militia itself, they assumed that every able-bodied man ages 18 to 45 would have some type of rifle, and that when called up to duty for the militia, he would bring his rifle with him and he would be competent in its usage so that they wouldn't have to train him on how to shoot it. And so what I'm getting at there again is sort of the difference between what they had then as a militia as opposed to what we have now, because like when, the Maryland Air National Guard gets called up to patrol the skies over Washington, D.C., Captain Snuffy doesn't show up with his own F-16, right? That's at the base for him. So that's a big difference that we have now. And I guess I want to finish up. I think the rest of the language of the Second Amendment is more or less straightforward, but the couple of places where I think we may get into debates, especially about how it applies today, is one, it says the right of the people. And so Thea, you've already alluded a little bit to, does that mean all people, or does that only mean people with reference to those people who are considered to be part of the militia, as the prefatory clause said? To keep and bear arms, what does that mean by arms? And shall not be infringed. In all of my research, that was probably the one part that most of the history and poli-sci professors really could not determine definitively whether they meant like that is an absolute, cannot, shall not be infringed at all, or they sort of implicitly understood that there are certain times when an infringement of that right is necessary or desirable.
Well, Dion, I think with that part, there's a lot of writings that you can find regarding that era where this was not a right that was given by the government to bear arms. This was an extension of what we talked about before about the inalienable rights that humans have, is that it's the right to defend self and property, right? So that's just kind of one of those given things that you have. And so in order to defend, weapons are often necessary, and you need to be able to defend in counter to whatever you're being attacked with. So it's, again, comes down to it where governments don't give the right to this. It's part of the extension of natural rights of survival and self-defense. So in terms of the not to be infringed, that's really where that comes from, is that the government can't take it away because they're not supposed to.
I don't know if it's for this beginning section, Dion, or if it's for the next section, but as you were bringing up, essentially white free men, 18 to 45, essentially being a very literal interpretation of the Constitution, whereas today we've kind of allowed that to mean everybody. One of my big things has been whether or not you're a strict constitutionalist, letter of the law shall not be infringed person, or whether you are a living document type person in how you interpret the Constitution. There's arguments to be made for and against both of those, but I don't think you can be a literalist for half of a sentence and then a revisionist for the second half of the sentence. I don't think you can say, well, shall not be infringed means shall not be infringed. But before, when they were talking about free white men, I mean, times have changed. So really, we mean everybody now. I think if you're going to pick one, you got to pick one.
I think, yeah, I'll go on.
Well, I was going to say, part of me agrees with you. There is a sense of hypocrisy there if you're going to say I'm going to pick and choose this part to be literal and this part to be revisionist. At the same time, I think that you can also make the case that you could do that because they are somewhat different topics, right? So if we talk about like who is a person, I think you could easily make the argument that it was just dumb and short-sighted of them to not consider Black people to be people. But you could still hold to when they meant, or when they said shall not be infringed, they truly meant shall not be infringed. I don't think those are necessarily in conflict with each other, but I do take your point.
And to be honest, it's not even just within the Second Amendment. I know that's what we're keeping it to right now, but for all the other parts as well, if you want to be an originalist, fine, but you can't be an originalist for the Second Amendment and then a revisionist for another part of the Constitution.
And I think my problem with textualists and people who really focus on founders' intent, and kind of piggybacking off of this discussion, is that I've always had a hard time with being shackled to the lack of imagination of, property owning white males in the late 1780s, right? And so a lot of times the reality is I think you just said it, they couldn't have imagined X, right? There's so many aspects of where we've ended up all these hundreds of years later that the founders couldn't have imagined. And so when we try to, attempt to argue that this is what they intended they intended these words to apply to things today. We just, on its face, I just think that's not true. That's not I don't think that's true. Like pornography, right? We now say pornography is protected by the First Amendment, but I doubt anyone in good faith can believe that the founders intended, for that to be the thing that's protected by the First Amendment. I really don't believe that that's I don't think they imagined it, right? And so, but yet we've said, well, this is encompassed by this right. Again, they didn't imagine me having a right to bear arms. It didn't even occur to them that I could be part of a militia. The militia that they had in mind, the idea of the people that they thought had the right to stand up to the government, I was not in their imagination. Yet the Second Amendment under current, jurisprudence, technically applies to me. And so that's where it's a hard conversation to have when we really hook on, well, what did the founders mean by these words, right? So I guess this is where you were right, Dion. The question becomes not so much, okay, this is kind of how these words came to be. This is how this amendment came to be. But, maybe you're right in the sense that the more important conversation is, well, what does it mean to us today, right? How are we using these words as either a shield of these rights or a sword to be used against people or to infringe upon those rights, right? Or can these rights be infringed upon? And so that's where the tension is, is like, I feel like I get tired of being shackled by the lack of imagination by the founders, because, and what they envisioned as the tools that could be used to stand up to the government. Right. So one point I always make, you kind of hinted at it. This idea that, okay, if the government were going to oppress the people, then you would need the tools of war to oppose the government, right? And at that time, weapons would have been, military grade weapons would have been some type of rifle, right? Today, realistically, that would be some type of munitions, right? Like, everyone, I was arguing, what are you going to do with an AR-15 against a nuke? You know what I mean? Yet we don't allow the average citizen to possess and have a right to those types of weapons. We don't allow the average citizen to manufacture biological weapons. We don't, these are all things that have been infringed upon. But the argument could be made, well, these are the types of tools you really would need or would be more beneficial than just a rifle. So it kind of goes, that's where it's like this idea that we infringe upon other tools, but just a gun, that's the thing that can't be infringed upon. And that's where I'm always like, that doesn't make sense.
Well, this is where
we should infringe upon those other things, because if the government's so powerful to be able to do those things, how are we ever supposed to have any type of fight against tyranny?
Do you believe that?
Brett Miller says we should have nukes.
No, I mean, do you believe that people should be able to have nuclear, in theory, that anyone should be able to have a nuclear weapon? Anybody should be able to, have sarin and produce sarin gas? Real question, do you believe that? And if so, why?
Do I honestly believe that? No, I don't. And the coupling argument that goes along with that honestly has nothing to do with the munitions themselves. It has to do more with the moral decay of our society, that I honestly don't think people can be trusted with those kind of things, because there is a distinct lack of care for people. I mean, you guys have known me through several of these conversations that I'm very much about people, and it's people first. And I love people. Unfortunately, people are very flawed. But, if, kind of playing off what you're saying, Thea, is if you're going to say, well, I believe in this limitation, but not other limitations, it kind of goes the other way of like, well, why not? If the government has grown to a point where they can oppress the people and we have no recourse against it, then really, what point is a gun, right? So how do we fight back? How do we push back against tyranny? I mean,
the argument that you just made of why you're against the idea of people having biological weapons, nuclear weapons of that nature is my exact how I feel about the way that we have allowed the ownership of firearms to be so unregulated. That's exactly the reason I'm uncomfortable with it.
Well, I think that comes with the first. Yeah. I think that comes with the first part of the Second Amendment, though, Thea, is where we have the well-regulated militia. We've gone to a point where our fighting force is state ordained. Right. We no longer have a civilian-led force that has proper training, proper discipline, and the munitions and weaponry to go along with it. Because when you take the power away from the people, it fails, right? And it's become to the point where the people become so reliant on the government that they've no longer put in the effort into these areas. They're no longer disciplined around it. And so it continues to fail. In coupling that along with, again, the moral decline that we see with our society, that people honestly just don't care about each other like they should. They become extremely individualistic. It creates problems. But if we have that discipline instilled at a young age and we teach proper moral fabric, and then you put weapons in the hands of people who have that, I think it's a different story.
But that's not where we are.
Right. So if that's not the world that we live in today, as you have said, there's a moral decline and people are very individualistic and you can't trust them with certain weapons. Why draw the line at guns to say, well, you can trust them with this weapon, but not with that weapon?
And here's the thing, and I think this is true of a lot of people on the left. I am not anti-gun per se, and the idea that nobody should be able to have a gun. I'm not that type of progressive, right? Obviously, I was in the military. I can shoot a weapon. I think most people, that's a skill set that gets lost in our population, being able to safely operate a firearm. But I am a believer that we can have, what's the token line? Good, reasonable, good sense, laws, firearm, laws that restrict the ownership and the abundance of firearms in our population. And this idea that the Second Amendment somehow is a super right that there can be no regulation. And the way that people take that last line infringed upon so literally, now we've created a system where it's like everybody should be able to have a gun. There should be no ability of the government to regulate who has guns, how they use them, the types of guns that they are able to buy. There's this complete lack of, ability to engage in a real conversation about how do we protect ourselves from this moral decay, right? So it's like, well, we acknowledge there's a moral decay in our society. We acknowledge that there are people amongst us that will use these tools to harm the population. And so the answer is, well, there's nothing we can do about it because everybody has this right to do, and last week we talked about, we all have rights, but the limits of our rights come when our rights create tyranny upon our neighbors. And one of the main tools that are used to create that tyranny in our current society are firearms. And we've just allowed it to just be a necessary evil so that some people can, go hunt with an AR-15. That's where I have a problem.
So Thea, I would say that, you mentioned that people talk about infringement being, an ultimate, an absolute, and that this is something that people keep talking about the Second Amendment as being absolute. And I would argue that the disparity between the amount of force that the federal government has at its disposal versus even the most well-armed citizen is so lopsided that the proponents of the Second Amendment have to fight tooth and nail because they are already fighting from a significantly unbalanced position. Right. So already even explosives. Right. So even like a farmer or a rancher who needs to go and clear some land has to go through a ridiculous amount of paperwork and stuff just to use, your typical explosives just to clear some land away or just to get rid of a stump or something. Right. And so people would argue that we've already eroded away the parity between the civilian populace and the standing army so much that we have to fight ferociously for what remains.
But Dion, no number of AR-15s is ever going to equal what the standing army has.
And you're making my point for me.
But
then you should be arguing that you. To me, then your point doesn't make sense, because if that's really how you feel, then argue that you should have nukes. Argue you should be able to have those bomb munitions. Because if the argument is that people should be as armed, then it would be easier for me to swallow that this is for the purpose. The reason that people are arguing that these rights should be uninfringed is really based on this notion of a militia. If they were actually arguing for things that would be a modern day militia, or the types of tools that a modern day militia would need to actually oppose the United States government, right? But that's not really where these arguments happen more recently. I know you had in the notes the Bruen case, right? In the Bruen matter, we were talking about concealed carry. We're talking about the ability to have a firearm that you're concealing on your person when you're in public, right, without anyone knowing you have a weapon. That's not necessary unless you're trying to hide a gun to go, do violence against some government official. That's not really part of the militia or for that purpose, right? So that's where I have a hard time with this argument that it's about the government and fighting back on the government.
Okay, so on your first point, I would say, I'm a resident of the state of Virginia. I think the state of Virginia should have all of that capability, where if for whatever reason the federal government, the standing army became tyrannical, the state of Virginia could muster up an equivalent force to be able to fight back against the.
But does that mean that you, Dion Dixon, should have that force in your backyard?
Where that argument falls short, though, Dion, is that earlier you said that you didn't want to talk about like the Virginia National Guard as the militia. You wanted to talk about individuals, every individual being the militia. I mean, the Virginia National Guard does have those capabilities.
Yeah. So I guess let me try to make my previous point a little bit more clear. In attempting to define what the founding fathers had written down, I wanted to make sure that everybody understood that essentially there was a draft, and everybody was eligible for the draft because the numbers were so low that essentially every single man, like if it came to it, every single man was going to be called up because we didn't have 300 and some odd million people living in the country. And so that's another distinction between 1789 and 2025, right? So one, I wanted to make that point because that was their intent. That was to Thea's point, because they were living in that time. That was the extent of their creativity, right? That was the extent of their imagination. That was what they knew was if something were to go down, I need every man to grab a rifle. There wouldn't really be anybody sitting around just watching on the sidelines. To the other point about the Virginia National Guard, right? So the way that we've structured it today really doesn't fit the model of a state militia as they had 200 years ago. It's been much more federalized and much more nationalized, especially since World War II. And I think we've gone the wrong way with that. Now, having come from active duty Air Force, I kind of understand why we did that, because a lot of times when we actually did need to pull up the Guard and Reserve to go serve before we made some of those changes, they just weren't ready because they hadn't been practicing. They hadn't been exercising the way that they needed to understand how to go fight. And they were a liability to themselves and to others that were serving with them. So I get it. But yeah, so does that kind of clarify what I was talking about earlier?
I guess my issue, Dion, I'm not even disagreeing with the notion that the state of California, separate from the current structure of the National Guard, if they wanted to have the California militia and set up and maintain their own weapons, and through the democratic process, the citizens of California figured out what levels of weapons that they should have and all that. And I'm not even disagreeing with you, because I don't think that's where we are. I don't think that's the issue here. The issue is, should Dion Dixon have that level of weaponry in his backyard, and he solely makes the decision of how to use those weapons and against whom they should be used, and that the government, the federal government, I guess in this case, shouldn't have the right to restrict you from doing so, right? And that shouldn't be infringed upon. Your right to build your own arsenal of anything, right? Any weapons necessary that would be used to somehow rebel against, the government, that you should be able to do that. And my problem is that's not what this is about in today's society, right? That's not what this is about. This is, because people aren't arguing I should be able to have my own munitions dump in my backyard. They're arguing I should be able to have this gun, and I should be able to buy it, and anybody should be able to buy it. And anytime someone says, well, maybe we can still have these guns, but here, maybe we should restrict access in this way. Then it's like there's no ability to have a conversation of, well, maybe those restrictions make sense for our society as a whole, because look at what the lack of those restrictions has resulted in, right? We are still the only country in the world that has these types of frequent mass shootings in our elementary schools. I mean, only, I would say, quote unquote, civilized country. We're not in the middle of a civil war. We're not in the middle of, we're not a failed state. So for us to be who we are, and it's so routine that we have to teach our children how to respond to mass shootings, because it happens so frequently that there is a likelihood that any one of our kids could go to school tomorrow and this could happen. To me, that it's mind-blowing that we won't do anything about it, or anytime the discussion happens, we are limited to thoughts and prayers. And the argument I always hear from the right is, well, the Second Amendment says you can't infringe upon this right.
Okay, so you brought up school shootings, and so we may as well go into that. So I would bring up that, like, for decades, you would see the whole school parking lot full of pickup trucks with shotguns and rifles just hanging in the back of the pickup truck. And kids they would show up to school, they'd have their guns in the back, and after school was let out, they would go out hunting, they would go out plinking cans in the forest. Like that, I mean, that happened for decades, and we didn't have school shooting issues. The school shooting thing really kind of became a national crisis with Columbine. I think that was kind of the big one. And so I would argue, like, we have had more restrictions on firearms in the past 40 years, at least, than we had in the previous 40 years to that. And yet we've had far more school shootings. So I don't think that it's necessarily the availability or the types of firearms that are out there so much as a mental health crisis.
I mean, you're making an argument that because there wasn't a problem before X date, then that means that a problem evolved, right? Society, things change in societies and problems immerse, right? And once they do,
people got meaner, let's say.
Yeah, we address the problem.
There's actually evidence to show that. I mean, just looking at numbers, right, from 2000 alone, from 2000 to 2025, looking at that time frame, over 60 million Americans have stepped down their faith, especially in Christianity. If you took three categories of non-Christians, non-practicing Christians, and practicing Christians, right? We're practicing is someone who's actively engaged. Non-practicing is the person that, you push them in a corner, they'll finally admit they're a Christian, but you couldn't tell it from their daily lives, to people who are non-Christians, right? In that time frame, 25 years, 30 million have gone from non-practicing to non-believing, and another 30 million have gone from practicing to non-practicing. So we've seen a shift of 60 million people that have stepped down in their moral standings in just 25 years, let alone like previously.
But I mean, but we're making the argument. Okay, so you're making the argument that essentially there's been a moral decay. Right. So
yeah, and so really kind of my argument with that, Thea, is that yes, we're talking about gun control, but honestly, I think we should be worried more about heart control, right? Actually talking about standards and education around that standpoint. Agreed.
There's nothing that says we can't do both. Well, the people who argue that we can't regulate guns because of the Second Amendment, it's like, to me, I'm not saying we can't address the moral decline. We can't address things that are impacting how we get to the point where we have these mass shootings, or we have such high volumes of gun violence in our society. We can address those other issues, but I don't understand why that means we also can't address the access to guns, or we can't have smart gun policy at the same time. Like, I don't think it's mutually exclusive of one another, right?
Well, so
right now, it feels like we're not doing either.
What kind of smart gun policy are you talking about when you say like common sense gun policy or smart gun policy?
Like, I disagree with the holding in Bruen, right? I don't think that I didn't think that it was this infringement upon people's rights to have a concealed, the whole restrictions on concealed carry in the state of New York, right? I do think that, having people register guns, having waiting periods, having restrictions on people's ability to own firearms when they've had certain types of indications, like, domestic violence, having, different levels of criminal behavior. I think all of those things combined make sense. I also have issues with, high capacity weapons and full, I have a lot of problems with, there's a myriad of different regulations, and the argument against all of them seems to be the same, right? It always seems to be, but that infringes upon my quote unquote Second Amendment right. And I'm like, what about my right to send my kid to school and not have to worry about them being gunned down in school? Right. That's the part that I and it's never, I'm waiting to hear an argument that says why we can't have different rules in place and regulations in place so that quote unquote, high moral gun owners, responsible gun owners can still own their weapons. Right. And then other people can have, maybe we don't make it so easy for every unstable person to access a gun. Or we also hold accountable the people who aren't responsible with their weapons. I think we're just now seeing the whole parents going down for giving their kids guns and then them using them in mass shootings.
Yeah. So going back to Bruen, I think the big thing there, especially with the concealed carry permits, was not that I didn't read Bruen to just open up the floodgates. What I read in Bruen was that the government can't just arbitrarily decide that somebody doesn't get a concealed carry permit, because there were all these states that were may issue states. And basically, you had to go and interview with your local sheriff. And if the local sheriff just didn't think you had a good reason, he could deny you a permit. And that's not a good way to regulate anything, right? Just based on one guy's opinion. So, it could actually be, and this happened in California too, where the local sheriff is like, well, I don't like black people, so Thea doesn't get a concealed carry permit, even though maybe you were the victim of spousal abuse or whatever, and you really needed it. But that was the part of Bruen that I think was the real win, was that the state had to show a compelling reason, a legal compelling reason why that person should not have a permit. And I think that's the right thing to do. As far as sending kids to school, and I know this is an emotional topic. So for our listeners and viewers, look, all four of us here on this podcast are parents. I'm sure each and every one of us loves our children more than our own lives. And so I want you to hear what I'm about to say from the viewpoint that I am a parent and I love my child, and I would watch the entire world burn over twice to save my own son. Okay, that's how much I love him. So, but what I want to say here is I pulled up the 2023 FBI statistics on active shooter incidents in the notes, and you guys can see them too if you're in the notes. According to the FBI, which defines active shooter incident as one or more individuals actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people in a populated area. There were 48 of these in 2023 that fit their definition, and that's the latest year that they've published any data. 27% of these, which is just 16 of those incidents, use a rifle of any kind, which includes assault weapons. So that's not to say that all 16 of those incidents used, and I have to put assault weapons in quotes because there isn't a firm definition of what an assault weapon is, but typically people think like an AR-15 style rifle. 72% of those incidents, which is 43 of them, were committed with a handgun. And only 3 of those 48 incidents occurred in schools. The other thing that I noticed is that there is no clear correlation. I've got 2 maps in the notes. There's no clear correlation between where those incidents happened and which states have very strict gun laws and assault weapons bans. For instance, the most number of those incidents, according to the FBI, happened in California, which also happens to have some of the strictest assault weapons bans. And also they happened in Washington, also has strict bans. But then the next highest number was in Texas, which has very, lax gun laws. We had some in Georgia and Florida and,
so,
all those quote unquote southern red states.
To that point, okay, so there's no correlation with the maps that you're looking at. Got it. But earlier you were talking about, people used to have guns in their trucks and that we didn't have this issue. But ever since we started having more restrictions on guns, now we're having more shootings. And you're implying a correlation there.
Sorry, what I was actually trying to do was say that they're really is no causation, that there may be correlation, but pinpointing the causation is tough.
But to both what you and Brett have been saying is that there's a moral decline, that people are more out for themselves. You can't trust them with certain weapons. But then you're falling back on an argument that says, even though society has changed, our Second Amendment cannot. That the right to bear arms cannot. That even though things are getting worse, we're going to keep sticking to this like original belief that obviously is not working because things are still getting worse.
Well, no, I firmly believe the Constitution is a living document, but our founders gave us ways to change the Constitution. What I really get upset about, and this applies to the Second Amendment, this applies to the First Amendment, every amendment that we have, right, is that Congress will come in, or the executive branch with their executive orders will come in with things that fundamentally alter the practice of the U.S. Constitution without going through the process of actually amending the Constitution to account for what they want. So if you're not going to do that, right, and I guarantee you any attempt to amend the Constitution to further restrict the Second Amendment is going to fail. And that's why they don't do that. But it is frankly unconstitutional and illegal to try to change the context of the Constitution without actually going through the process of changing the context of the Constitution.
This comes back to the beginning of the conversation, but I think I said this before we got on air, as far as how you believe, what you believe the full context of the Second Amendment to mean, right? And so if I personally believe it, the intent and the words mean that the ownership of weapons is tied to this belief that people would organize and have this militia, right? Then I think that infringing upon the right of the people to organize and establish and maintain a militia that can, oppose the government, I think that is a separate right and a separate act than what we see when we talk about individuals' rights to own these different levels of weapons without any restriction whatsoever. And so that's where I push back. The other things I wanted to address, I appreciate that you like to use statistics. I've noticed that throughout a lot of our podcasts that you tend to bring in numbers, right? So I'll use numbers. There were 19 children that died in the Uvalde shooting a few years ago. Those were 19 people. And maybe in the grand scheme of things, that's a small number. But to the people who lost their kids, that their whole world was destroyed on that day, right? 27 children died in Sandy Hook, or 27 people, right? I think 20 of them were children. And that changed the moral character of our country that day. But to those families, to those people, they've lived with that every day since, right? And so those numbers may not be big, but I come back to, we've basically said we are okay living in a country where these things are just allowed to happen without any type of response because of some other person's arbitrary right to maintain some arsenal, to fight up against the government in some way that in reality we know wouldn't even achieve the outcome that they say that they're fighting for. And that's where it's like we're living in this fantasy of 1789 and ignoring the reality of 2025. And so you can give me numbers, right? The reality is, as long as Texas and California have different laws and we don't have border patrol between each state, we're always going to be at the lowest denominator for our gun laws. So whatever state has the least restrictions, that's what you're going to see, because it enables anybody in the country really to go to that state, get a gun, and come back to their state. It's not that hard for weapons to cross. We also know with the internet, and we know with the way that, we have all these different ways for people to obtain weapons. It's changed the availability of guns from when you were talking about people having gun racks in the back of their pickup trucks 30, 40 years ago. Things have changed, but we refuse to adjust. And that's where, again, it's a hard conversation to have. Yeah, the numbers may not support that every kid is going to be affected by a mass shooting, but when it's your kid, I always feel my heart breaks when I see those parents, because I think that's the thing. I don't want that to be me someday, or I hate that somebody else suffered, but yet we won't do anything to prevent the next family from having to suffer in that way. And that's where I have a hard time with the argument about the numbers or about where these things happen and things like that.
But you know that your kids are like 100 times more likely to be killed by a drunk driver than to be killed by a gun.
And yet I agree with all the laws that restrict the access of different people to alcohol.
But people will still break the law and they will still drink and drive. Now, if you look at every single one of those, if you look at every single one of those school shooting cases, so many laws were broken in the lead up to that, right? So passing more laws, like nobody has ever been able to propose a law that would actually have prevented any of those. All it would do is add one more law that would have been broken by that person in the commission of that heinous act. And so when you said we need more or different laws, so I would entertain the idea of maybe different laws, but like, you know, you were talking about how like guns are easier to get because of the internet and everything. Like I've ordered guns on the internet. You can't just order it and it shows up to your house. You order it and it goes to an FFL, and then you have to go to the FFL and you have to do the background check to pick it up. Otherwise you don't get it, right? You have to, like, if you go to a gun show, a lot of people are like, oh, gun show loophole, right? No, every single vendor at a gun show has their little laptop there and they run a NICS background check if you buy something from them. You can't just go to a gun show and be like, oh, it's a gun show, so I don't have to do a background check. Now, the gun show loophole that people are talking about is like sometimes somebody will be walking around, they'll overhear somebody be like, hey, I want that new Glock, you know, that Gen 5 Glock 19. And the other guy's like, oh, I have one that I don't want anymore. Do you want to buy it for me? And they go in the back parking lot and they do a private transaction. In most states, that's illegal now, right? So like,
but not at all.
I've done private transactions where we called up the local FFL. We're like, hey, we're doing this transaction, and I paid my $20 for the background check to get the firearm transferred to me, right? So people who do this legally, right? Like, I guess criminals break the law. That's by definition a criminal, and I don't know what laws we could pass that would actually fix the safety issue that you're concerned about versus just continuously whittling away the rights of people who frankly have done nothing to deserve having them taken away.
So you guys are going to keep coming back around to my argument every time. You can't legislate morality. It's just going to be there. And as we continue to drift further from that, more laws are not going to be the issue, because unless you fix the hard issues, I don't care what laws you put out there. To Dion's point, a criminal is going to break the law. You know, it's the whole reason you have locks on your house, right, is to keep people out. But if somebody wants into your house, they're going to break in. You're not going to stop it.
But sometimes more laws and regulations prevent people from going. Like, people go and check the doors of cars that are parked in the driveway, and if it's locked, they'll skip it and they'll go to the next one.
But they're still looking.
Dion's point falls apart where he says that's just one more law that they would have to break to conduct that crime, right? But we don't know. You're trying to prove a negative. If we had one more law, that's just one more they would have broken before they went and shot up that school. How many of those schools would not have gotten shot up because there was one more obstacle for someone to overcome? You can't just say because someone shot up Sandy Hook, having 10 more laws still would have led Sandy Hook to happen. We don't know what would have happened. You know, like you can't just assume that they will be successful in breaking all of those laws because they weren't there.
And it may not be with a gun either. If somebody wants to hurt somebody, they're going to find a way to do it. I mean, heck, I came across a copy of the Anarchist Cookbook when I was in high school. There are plenty of opportunities if you find materials that you know how to make stuff that will hurt people, and if you have the heart to hurt people.
I mean,
lots of people use machetes, but they only get to kill two people.
Why? Okay, we've seen that there is a tool that people seem to have easy access to that they're using to harm others on a frequent basis, right? This is happening frequently in our society.
I don't know if frequent's the right term with that.
I'm not talking about
point with statistics. Like, that's not there.
Gun violence is frequent. I'm not just talking about school shootings, and I'm not just talking about So now I'm talking about gun violence, right? Gun violence is frequent in America, right? And it happens every day. And, you know, so I guess because it's not just school shootings that I have a problem with, right? I've represented victims of domestic violence in court, right? And one of those things, when you look at the threat, luckily we do have laws in place that once I can successfully go into court, or I as a lawyer or a person can successfully go into court and argue for a restraining order, one of the positive side effects is quite often, at least in the state of California, that person has to surrender their weapons, right? And that is a law that exists in California. It doesn't exist in every state, and that is one issue where we have seen, that there is a correlation for the people who are seeking these types of protections under the law. And if their abuser hasn't access to a weapon, quite often they use it to harm them, right? So it's not just mass shootings I'm talking about, right? Gun violence is a problem in America. And I've always had a hard time with, we won't engage with the tool that people are using to commit the harm, right? The conversation always has to be about something else other than, should these tools be so widely accessible for everybody, right? And if not, well, then can we have a conversation about how do we restrict access to these tools? But it seems like we can never have that conversation. And that's where I get frustrated.
I think, Thea, my biggest frustration is that I think the common belief out there is that these tools that you're talking about are way more accessible than they really are. I mean, it is a process to go through to go buy a gun. And if you are a legal law-abiding citizen, it is, at least for right now in the state of Virginia, it is not completely onerous, although they have limited us to purchasing one firearm or one handgun within a 30-day period, which I think is just kind of arbitrary and silly. I know you can always make a case of like, oh, well, if you're buying more than one handgun, but like if there's a great sale so like AAFES has fantastic prices on firearms, especially when you can find an AAFES that carries firearms, because they already have lower prices.
Stores.
AAFES is the Armed Forces store for
Armed Forces stores.
Yeah.
Sorry, for our listeners and viewers, those are like military only stores, but they don't charge sales tax and they already have lower prices. And so what if I wanted to go over to the local base and they had a great sale on one, and I was like, oh, my wife would like one of these too. And I can't buy two just because there's this arbitrary, like, is that going to completely ruin my life? No, but is it kind of like an arbitrary infringement that for the regular law-abiding citizen just doesn't make sense? And then if I were a criminal, right, if I were somebody who was like, well, fuck that, I want to buy two handguns because I want to, dual wield or whatever, I'm going to go find a way to do that, right? Like, I mean, the war on poverty, the war on drugs, like nothing has worked where we've tried to like wage war on something and go, we're just going to add regulations and laws to this to stop it from happening.
Well, actually, and this is going to come as a surprise that I'm about to say these words, because unfortunately it's true. The war on drugs to a certain extent did work, right? There's one of the main reasons you don't have a crack epidemic going on right now. And I mean, it was a cruel way to do it, but is because there was a result of the war on drugs, right? So I'm not saying, and I'm not using that. That's a whole nother argument. And I can.
We locked up
I don't
a
think
lot
it was
of people that should not be in jail
exactly.
right now.
And I will.
And I don't think that's a very good. I don't think that is a very good example of how we should do things.
I'm not saying that's how we should do things. I'm just negating the point that you made that laws never and having laws, it never has an impact on the problem that it seeks to address. Nor am I arguing
definitely
that
don't
we
want to go down that
guns.
path with guns.
I
do not want to see.
I just address. I agree, but I all I did was directly address the fact that an argument you made. I countered it, right? I countered an argument that you made. I didn't propose or that should be how we address guns. That's not what I've said. Right. So I'm going to be clear.
It's important to remember that Dion is the libertarian and he has never met a law that he likes of any kind.
Yeah, that's fine. But I
guess
the reality
libertarian.
is, yeah, but the reality is sometimes we like I said, there are laws that have had, I mean, there's a million unintended consequences of the war on drugs, right? So I'm not going to say that I'm not advocating that that's how we should approach guns. But when you say, creating laws and having a heavy hand of the government doesn't doesn't work to address the problem that it seeks to address. That's not necessarily true, but I would come back to what kind of country do we want to be, right? I obviously I do have a problem with war on drugs because of the moral implications of it.
I would say it didn't work in the fact that the unintended consequences of it, or possibly the intended consequences, depending on how cynical you are of our government, were so horrendous that
yes.
it was not worth solving the problem that it solved. So in that way, I would say it didn't work.
Okay. I guess I'm arguing if the problem was reducing the amount of crack on the streets and the amount of people that were addicted to crack cocaine at the time, late 80s into the 90s, it worked to address that problem, but it created a myriad of other problems in our society.
A closer example, Dion, the 94 assault weapons ban resulted in less assault weapons crimes. There were other issues, unintended consequences, but banning assault weapons in 94 led to less assault weapon shootings. Like, you can address specific issues with these laws.
So I've seen differing statistics, and it depends on the source. And Thea, you're right. I like to use statistics in these things, but we should take them with a grain of salt, because it is easy to make the data say what you want it to say, depending on how you frame it.
If you've ever noticed, that's why I don't use statistics. I'm a lawyer and I don't like statistics, because I sit there and I go to trial and everybody has their own expert, and their expert's going to somehow twist the data to fit whatever their agenda is. So I'm not a huge statistics so for example, I'm getting off topic, but bear with me. My son has asthma, and during COVID, everybody kept saying, oh, well, COVID is really only a risk to these types of people. But when my child was the kid who was at risk, who ended up in the ICU during COVID, actually with RSV, not even COVID, but ended up, seconds away from a ventilator, I didn't want to hear someone tell me, well, most kids aren't going to be at risk, because my kid was the kid at risk, And so the statistics may not have worked in most, for most people, the statistics were in their favor, but for the person who the statistic, you're the outlier, it's not comforting to have that number, right? So that's why when we say X number of, I had somebody argue with me about, what are the chances of me as a Black woman, being a victim of police violence, right? I mean, they're higher maybe than, Will as a white man. But to me, when you're the person that it happens to, it doesn't matter what the chances are or what the probabilities were, right? Unless it's zero, to me, sometimes it's worth addressing. So for this issue, I remember Columbine. We are all the age of Columbine, right? I mean, the shooters were within a year or two of us in age, right? I remember that vividly, right? I remember that day I was in school. I had gotten home.
One of my friends was at Columbine. One of my friends was at Columbine that day.
Yeah, I went to the academy with a Columbine survivor. She lived across the hall from me, and it was to me, I remember, it's like I think before 9/11, Columbine was one of those moments I look back on in my life, and I remember it just changed my reality. It changed the idea that could happen. It didn't occur to me that someone could come into school and kill me. Like it just didn't, and then it's like from that day on, reality was different, and unfortunately for my kids, they can't, when I've told them, like, I didn't even, I've talked to my 13-year-old about it, and she's like, there weren't school shootings when you were 13. I'm like, if they were, I didn't know about them. I wasn't aware. I didn't think that was we had earthquake drills when I was a kid. We hid under the table in case the roof fell in, but we didn't have active shooter drills, but they do, and it breaks my heart. It breaks my heart. And I just would like to have a conversation about what we really do about it, because when we talk about all these other topics, it just feels like we always hit a dead end. Every school shooting, thoughts and prayers. And then that's it. Or it's too soon. We don't want to politicize this topic, but I don't know. I just feel like there has to be a better conversation we could have, and we could address the use of these tools.
And I think it's a tough thing to do, Thea, because anytime you're involving emotion in law, it skews it. right? And again, we're all parents here. It would be a tragedy. I mean, trust me, with 4 kids, I know, like, I don't want anything to happen to my family, and I'd feel terrible with that stuff. But if you're looking to make law based on an emotional response, I don't think that's the appropriate way to come at it. Yes, it's tragic, but tragedies happen all the time. I mean, my goodness, there's almost, like, again, statistics, I get it, but I mean, there's 1,200 deaths every year from automobile accidents of children, but we're not outlawing automobiles.
But we have put in all sorts of ways to make cars more safe. We have gone through different means to criminalize behavior when people use cars wrong. But we have done things to try to make cars more safe. We do hold companies liable when they don't follow those regulations, right? We make it so that everybody legally is supposed to get a driver's license to even operate a vehicle, right? There's all these different things we put in place to try to minimize that risk, right? And to mitigate. But when
you get someone who grabs a vehicle and drives it into a crowd, as we just had here happen recently, right? What would have prevented that? What laws have we put in place with all of these things that would have kept it from happening?
We will have a we were all in the military. We know all those concrete barriers that get put up around bases and all these different measures that get put in place to try to address, okay, who should have access to base? Who can drive a car on base, right? Because that's the thing. We don't let just anybody drive a car on base, partially for security reasons, right? But, and we don't let just anybody walk onto base with a weapon, right? We say you can't walk onto a military installation, just any Joe Smo off the street with a gun, right? Because we are restricting who can have a gun and where they can have a gun. Because it's not just, can you own a gun? It's where you can have a gun, right? Because concealed carry permits and everything is talking about when can you have a weapon and can you conceal that weapon when you're in public? Where can you go with the gun? It's all of the conversation. It's not just about owning a weapon. It's what can you do with that weapon? Where can you possess that weapon? And should you just be free to have a gun anywhere, anytime, any place, because that's your Second Amendment right? That's a discussion that I want to be able to have, but it feels like we are never able to have that conversation to that level.
I want to bring
up
something. I think we probably almost have to have an entire podcast devoted to common sense gun laws, right? And we could talk about we could assume that a rational, reasonable, and common sense gun law would be constitutional for the sake of argument, and then launch into what those types of gun laws could be that maybe could make a change. And I think we could spend an entire hour talking about that. But one thing that I wanted to bring up.
Do you believe there are common sense gun laws, Dion?
I think common sense isn't common. And that's why we.
Can you give me an example of a restriction? Yes, I can, because I want to know the baseline. Is there a law?
Yeah, the moderate libertarian. The moderate libertarian believes that if you have a criminal history, a violent criminal history, I'm not talking about like white collar crimes, like you tax fraud or whatever. That's not a violent crime. But if you have a violent criminal history, then you should be restricted from purchasing and owning firearms. I think that's reasonable. That, to me, that is a common sense law. But a lot of these laws that attempt to be minority report and attempt to preempt crime, I think are unconstitutional. I just don't think that you could do that, because then you go down the path where, like in the UK, they're starting to restrict online sales of like kitchen knives because there have been so many knife attacks in London. So if you have a London address, you can't buy like kitchen knives from Amazon. And like it just becomes ridiculous. But one of the things that I wanted to bring up, especially as the libertarian,
that's a problem because they don't have access to guns. Pointing that out.
So they find another way.
So they find a way.
But one of the things. Could we be so lucky as to have knives be the weapon that's threatening our population? It's a lot easier to defend against somebody coming to attack you with a knife than with an AR-15. But the knife example, though, is someone who lives in the UK. It's just guns aren't a problem there, to the same extent that they are here.
We share massive land borders with Canada and Mexico, Whereas the United Kingdom is an island country. It's a lot easier to control what comes in and out of an island country. Same thing with Australia, right? The UK and Australia are always upheld as like, oh, we could be like them. No, they're both islands, and it's a lot easier to control what
I'm
comes
just
into an
addressing
island.
the
The
point
kind
you
of
were
gun
making.
violence we do either.
I'm not saying we should be the UK, but I'm addressing the irony and the point you were making. The reason that the UK is addressing the issues with knives is because they don't have the same prevalence of issues with guns, right? The weapon of choice there is a knife and not a gun. I was just addressing
that's
the
a
irony
fair
in
point
that.
to make, but we do have to live with the reality that the Second Amendment exists, and however we want to interpret it, it does in some form guarantee the right to keep and bear arms, and it's part of our fundamental document. So that doesn't just go away, right? So like I said before,
But that's
there is
my
a
point. Does
process
that
for
mean
us
you get
to
to have
amend it if
a
we want to.
weapon with you everywhere you go, unrestricted? That was the issue that I brought up, right? Is that we
And
have,
why not?
because Heller initially started with, okay, in your home where your rights are always at their strongest, right? So from a constitutional law perspective, your rights are typically at their peak in your own home, right? And so Heller addressed that, right? Said, yes, in your home, there shouldn't be this ability for the government to say you can't have a weapon and that it can't be loaded and all these different things. And Heller's establishing that's Heller versus DC, which is the Supreme Court decision in 2008, right? That kind of is considered like the landmark case that shifted where we saw jurisprudence go for the Second Amendment. Okay, if I don't have a huge problem with the Heller decision, I understood the reasoning. Scalia definitely marched us through the history of the Second Amendment in that decision. But now we've gotten to Bruen, right? In was it 22 was what that was decided, where now it's not like just 19, in your home. Yeah.
Wasn't it?
Bruen? When was anyway, Bruen was it wasn't 19. It was pretty recent. But but now it's okay. So now we're saying now when you're out in public, you're more likely to be in contact with other people. You're not necessarily just in your home. Now we're also saying the government can't, right? So it's like you were saying, it's restricted the government's ability to infringe upon this right. And it just feels like we've propped up this right at the expense of other rights, like we talked about last week, this freedom of, to be free from the tyranny of others. And so the government, you talk about a compelling government interest, right? A lot of times one of the compelling government interests is to protect the life of others. And we know that guns threaten, they do pose a threat to human life,
So I just think the person does. Right?
The use of the gun does.
I have a carry permit. The use of the gun does. I carry a lot.
Yes.
Right? And so there are so many people that I'm surrounded by that have no idea that I have a firearm on me, right? And the point of that is to not be conspicuous with it. But it's like a condom in college. It's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. Right. And I don't ever want to be in a situation where
when you misplace your condom or you misuse your condom, you're not likely to kill 20 people. Right. Or to instantly take a life. Right. So again, this is a tool that when misused or even by accident. Right. Like I'm not even saying it always has to be intentional, but it is a tool that by its nature is deadly. Right. And so this idea that just because, this idea that guns don't kill people, people kill people. But that doesn't mean that we don't have to look at the tool itself and say, is this something we need to address? Because we know this tool is dangerous. Guns are dangerous. Right. I think whether you are a gun owner or someone who's, afraid of guns, they are still a dangerous tool. They are weapons. Right. And in particular, we start talking about AR-15s and things like that. They are weapons of war. Right. So let's not downplay it. Whether I'm not saying no one should have it, but let's not downplay the reality that they are dangerous tools. They are weapons.
Yeah, I'll agree with you there.
Let me ask you a question, Dion. So you had just mentioned violent criminals should have restrictions placed on their right to bear arms, right? And that's coming from a moderate libertarian. Got it. Mm-hmm. So, but by acknowledging that, you are saying that there are certain instances where there can be restrictions on people's gun rights that shall not be infringed does not mean shall not be infringed in all cases. There are cases where it will be infringed. So we're now talking about kind of what you got to with, we need a whole nother episode to discuss. At some point, it seems to me that you're acknowledging that there are, I'm going to call them common sense, but there are common sense gun restrictions that exist that people should be able to get behind, right? And
yeah. So I would say that the common sense gun laws that I would get behind are those laws that recognize that a person that has abused their right no longer has a right to it. And that is how criminal law should work, right? But it should not be Minority Report preemptive. It shouldn't be, well, you could be a criminal with this, and therefore we're going to punish you beforehand.
Okay. So the next question, though, is because, and I know you had mentioned earlier, like, who gets to decide what common sense is, right? And you can go look at the notes, the stuff that I dropped there. If 85% of Americans are in favor of a certain restriction, does that not by its nature mean that it is a common sense restriction?
That's a slippery slope for me, because there
I
are,
agree that there is some number that you're going to then say, well, 55 to 60% might not be common sense. That's a little too 50-50.
Yeah,
right?
But there was a time when like 85% of scientists agreed that like black people had less intelligence than white people. So, right?
We're talking voters, we're talking voters, right? We're talking about people who are.
I get it, right? But like,
when the government,
I don't think that trusting the masses to something is a good idea on its face. Like,
but that's what I agree. You believe in as a libertarian, that the people
we have a constitutional republic, right? And I think there is a very strong reason to have a republic rather than a direct democracy. But anyways, we've gone really long today, and I love this discussion.
Actually, what I think you guys are talking on, though, this is kind of why Article 5 is there, right? To where we have a proper means established where the people might adjust or evolve their government, right? So this is where we get 2/3 of the House that deem it necessary. So it's, again, if the constituents believe that that is the point, they should be pushing that up the government to their representatives to be able to.
We don't have a direct democracy. So even though 85% of voters, of Americans, of whatever, want something, as Dion said, we all know that changing the Constitution is never going to work, because the people who actually get that vote, 2/3 of both houses, 3/4 of all states, it's not the
We're
people.
likely to veer off topic here because the gun lobby has had an outsized impact in a lot of what happens with gun legislation. And I know we're seeing a change in that, a swing in that pendulum, but I think that's another conversation of why we don't see action in government to address some of these issues and the impact of the gun lobby. But I know we're short on time. So I think we have to kind of regroup and maybe have a more narrow topic to come back to this at some point and make it a little bit more narrow, because it is such a broad topic. But I think we have highlighted where our disagreements lie here. And I think for the average viewer, it does show that I hope that what we've illustrated here tonight is that it's a conversation worth having, right? And it is worth pushing on these points because it's such a big topic and the stakes are so high, right? So I think it's a good conversation for us to continue to have, but perhaps we'll narrow the topic for next time.
Yeah, Thea, something I'd like to kind of bring up to sort of wrap this, to go on to like a future topic about this, is how do we get to that point? Right. Because Will, you're saying, 85% of the people think that there should be some type of restriction. Well, I think where you're going to get the pushback is, again, the whole premise of the Second Amendment is that it's our right to stand up to a tyrannical government and having the means to do so. So what if we change the mechanism in which we do that? Right. Where we talked before, to where if the states had a more of an unorganized militia, where it's not a state run thing, but it's a citizen run thing, but they had access to the weaponry and ordnance in order to stand up to the government, if they had the ability to access that through the right channels and means. And Dion, I know this is it's a hypothetical, but
I'm not giving those kind of weapons to the 3%ers.
Or that's what I'm saying. I mean, it's still regulated in a sense.
Militias.
No, but it's still regulated in a sense to where you have some type of process to that. People aren't holding these weapons in their backyard or in their house, right? They're in a facility that they would need to attend to. But I think if you had some means to where the people still felt comfortable that they had the means to push back on the government, I think they would be less inclined to feel the need to have those weapons in their house.
I will say, as a staunch Democrat, that my position has changed since Trump took office the first time. Previous to that, I thought y'all were nuts that you were ever going to have to defend yourself against a tyrannical government. I have since started to come around to, well, maybe we should have the ability to stand up against a tyrannical government. It's just that I don't have the F-16 available to me to do that. That's all.
Will, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that was the point that I was about to make for the Democrats, right? Because right now you have Trump, and we talked last week about how we kind of have a cult of personality. We have all three branches of government kind of marching in line with him. How, like, if you take it to the furthest extreme, where a lot of people want to see, especially on the Democrat side, they want to see that it's only the government, it's only the police and the military that have the guns, and the citizenry does not, right? Now imagine Trump controls the military, he controls the FBI, the ATF, the CIA, everything, right?
It just goes back to the fact there's not enough AR-15s for me to do anything about it.
Thank you. I just think it's a farce. That argument,
right? I'll just tell you, because you're outgunned, does that mean that you just give up?
Well, I'll say, like, if when you're making an argument, if the intent is to persuade your audience, I will say from the perspective of someone, like, that argument is just never going to be persuasive to me, because in reality, it's not going to achieve its ends, right? There aren't enough AR-15s in the world that are going to achieve this idea that you could stand up to the Trump administration if they came for you right now, right? And survive it. So, you know,
but you can make it hurt.
It's a hard argument for me to.
And a lot of people
my whole thing is, I'm not arguing no guns, but I'm not arguing no guns, right? You can still do that with gun regulations. And that's my thing. The regulations, like I think, like I said, the meat and potatoes of our discussion probably is what is a common sense gun law, and how can those be formed? And let's talk about what those are. So that's probably the conversation I'm more willing to engage with, because I agree with you. I'm not saying people shouldn't own, no one should have a gun, but I am questioning, does everybody, I don't want to live in Tennessee. I don't want my black son going to school with teachers who now have guns, right? So the minute that he makes them nervous, my nephew is 6'3", right? And he's 16 years old, right? No one looks at him and sees a child, but I still see that 2-year-old I used to squeeze his cheeks, right? I don't want him going to school and his teacher having a gun in the classroom. So the minute he spooks them, they shoot him and make the argument that every cop, you know, or not every, but many cops have made. I felt threatened by the presence of X person, right? So there's a whole lot of things I would like us to talk about, but you're right. It probably needs to be more narrow, you know, as to when can you have guns? Where can you have guns? You know, not just can you possess a weapon, or, you know, can you own it? But should there be restrictions on how we have guns operating in our society? All right, we're so over.
Yeah, we went way over time. We went way over time, but hopefully you all enjoyed it, because I think this was a passionate discussion. I really appreciate it. I think everybody brought their A game today. That was great. I'm going to go last on what's been making us happy, and I'll close us out today. So who wants to start us off?
I'll start off. I feel like I never have like anything really deep. But what's making me happy is, yesterday, one of my friends, she's vegan, her husband's vegan, and I feel like I beat up on vegans a lot because I'm a pretty big meat eater. And she invited us to a brewery in LA that was having a vegan Mardi Gras like food truck celebration. And I was like, man, this couldn't be more of like a liberal, like, you know what I mean? Just like, I was like, okay. So I kind of went, and I took my mom because she was in town, and we went and we took the kids, and I actually had a really good time. The food was actually really good. And I looked around and I saw the people that were there, and it was a hodgepodge of people, like every color, every, you know, different genders, different, love is love type of environment. And everybody was just having a really good time. And it was nice. And it made me happy because I feel like with this whole idea that our diversity is somehow not our strength as a country, and this idea that our diversity pulls us apart. And I went to this event that was not my jam, and I had so much fun. And I felt like I was talking to this one lady about why she was a vegan, and I was getting recipes from her, and I have a garden, and I was talking about my garden, and she was telling me about hers, and I had a good time. And it made me happy that that's still a thing, and it kind of negates if you believe what you read in the news. So that's what's making me happy. Vegan Mardi Gras celebrations at breweries in LA. So.
All right. I got your not deep one for this week, Thea.
Okay.
The cat chose me was my, like, the cat never chooses me. The cat never sits in my lap. He never purrs for me. And yesterday the cat chose me and was just purring like crazy, sitting in my lap. I was petting him, and I got a couple seconds of like, wow, this is nice, to feel that love. That's what's making me happy.
What's the cat's name?
Snow. He's white.
Okay.
It's my daughter's cat.
Say mine wasn't quite a cat, Will, but my son kind of did the same thing. It's he opted to come into more or less. Like he opted to join me this morning in kind of the adult area at church, right? And instead of going to the kids ministry, he came in with me, and it's a little over his head, so he's kind of bored. But so the same thing, he kind of laid down in my lap for a little bit. It was just kind of there, but it was just cool that he opted to come with me. I thought it was pretty neat. And Thea, I'm kind of with you on the animals thing, right? I mean, if animals didn't want to be eaten, they shouldn't be so tasty. It's kind of my thought. But I will say there is a restaurant. There's a restaurant. I can't remember the name of it, but it's downtown St. Louis. That it is a vegan and whiskey bar, and they've got some fantastic food. So anyway, I can't remember the name of it. I'd have to look it up. But anyway, yeah, you can make some great recipes for sure.
Yeah.
For me, for a while there, I've been having a little bit of a rough working relationship with somebody at work. And I was discussing it with my wife, and just her ability to know me, right? And to be able to say, hey, Dion, well, you said this, but did you say it in this way that you normally say it? And I was like, yeah. And she's like, well, other people might take it this way, and, here are your strengths. Maybe you could play to that, and maybe phrase this way instead of the way that you were going to. Like, most people don't do well when you approach them with listen, MF, or, that kind of, whatever. But anyways, it was a great moment to just remind me of why, among the many, many reasons, right, why I married this woman, because she gets me, and she's so supportive, and she was just so very, just so very successful in that interaction with me, where she knew exactly what to say and how to say it to me to get me to understand what I needed to do. And her advice was very good, and it helped smooth a lot of things out in this work relationship that I have. So that was what made me happy is she's great for me. I don't know that she would work for anybody else, but she's perfect for me. So were
you carrying at the time of this disagreement with your coworker?
No, I'm not allowed to carry in that building. Yeah, well, sorry we went extremely long this time. Apologies to everybody, but hopefully you did enjoy it. And as Thea said, we probably need to revisit this topic in a little bit more narrow format, maybe talk about what makes sense as common sense gun laws. And if you haven't already, like and subscribe, and come back and see us and listen to us again. And we'll talk to you guys later. Out here.
Every week.